One of the questions I was thinking about as I was listening to your thoughtful and rich presentation is what do we understand about the role of the actual of Cold War events that we've covered in in some of the other presentations? Is this history running parallel to that? Is it running against that? How do you in your teaching integrate, for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Korean War with this rich history you've presented?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's all very much interconnected. And, when we think about Latino history, as I mentioned, we're talking about a number of groups of various national groups, right? Whose migration is spurred by geopolitical, factors, right? So when talking about, for example, the Cuban American community, they're going to have a very distinct political perspective and point of view by virtue of their the movement. And people that came from Cuba in the 50s are going to be very different and have a very different experience from the ones who came much later, where it was much more of an economic sort of a movement as opposed to a political one. The case of civil rights, I think, is one that has to be told in tandem with the, sort of these Cold War politics, the idea of containment, the idea of, certainly many organizations were targeted and viewed as subversive organizations because, in a lot of ways, civil rights was challenging the status quo. Right. So, groups and individuals, Luisa Moreno faced deportation for her labor activism and her involvement, was investigated by, sort of people who were sort of rooting out, sort of radicals and subversives. And some of the people who were involved in El Congreso were members of the Communist Party, people who were involved in labor organizations. So, I think that we have to, again, place it in the context of the time, and that shifts and changes, and be attentive to that. And that it affected other groups too, right? The FBI sort of investigating and monitoring Martin Luther King Jr., so that these are very common themes that helps bring these together.
Sure. Surveillance, containment, also the experience of Mexican Americans and other Latinx individuals serving in the American military in Korea and elsewhere as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And that, for members of LULAC, that's an important issue, right? It's, an organization I didn't get to mention, and somebody who used to be mentioned in the standards, but is now no longer in the standards, is Dr. Hector P. Garcia, the founder of the American GI Forum, right? And so much like, the Double V campaign that focused defeating fascism abroad and racism at home, that we associate with the African American civil rights struggle, those were very real issues in the Latino community as well, right? So, Dr. Hector P. Garcia and the American GI Forum are kind of formed because veterans of war, are not able to, they're not getting a quick response at the VA, and they're encountering, they've fought abroad and they don't have basic rights at home when they return. So absolutely.
Excellent. So we have some terrific questions from the teachers as well, of course. Clarissa Rangel asks, what role did the church play in the history of Latinx civil rights?
Yeah, so the church played a really interesting and complex role, and and I guess I should say the church is. So we often think of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church, alternately was supportive of civil rights activism. So you see, kind of pushing for better living and working conditions, being supported, for example, in 1938, going back to the pecan sheller strike of 1938 in San Antonio, you see the Catholic Church providing, food and, sort of like soup kitchens for the strikers who are pushing for better conditions. In the case of the farm workers, you have a really interesting relationship because Cesar Chavez, as you'll see in the document, really appealed to Catholic social justice teaching. And he used a lot of the symbolism of the Catholic Church And the Catholic Church was very divided because on the one hand, there were those who were very much involved with the movement, and supporting the strikers and kind of moving out of this Catholic social teaching, the reference to the writings by Pope Pius the 13th, I believe, on the dignity of workers. But then you also had those who sided with the growers, because the growers were the people who were also members of the Catholic Church, and it was a divisive issue. So, the churches, and then, Protestant denominations as well, kind of involved in, kind of providing support and pushing for rights as well. But it's also a very complex story. I can talk a little bit more about the tortilla priests in the farm worker movement. So
That's great. I hadn't heard the phrase tortilla priests.
yeah, so the tortilla priests were, so there were some part of Cesar Chavez's approach. I mean, we'll talk about the pilgrimage to Delano, which was done during Lent. So it was framed as as kind of a show of faith and piety and penance. And he would also kind of go on these hunger strikes to raise the attention of the plight of the workers. And he would break fast. There were some priests who would do communion with tortillas, and so there was a memoir that was written called Confessions of a Tortilla Priest, and they got in trouble for doing that from from the higher ups in the church hierarchy.
I love that phrase, though. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so Misty Jenkins asks, how do you suggest bringing these ideologies forward to modern day, when students tend to isolate them within the 60s and 70s in communities in Texas that are heavily Hispanic? And if I could add on to that, one other thing I was thinking, how do we connect it also to sometimes the evidence that at least some Latinx communities tend to maybe even vote Republican in certain, right? They tend to be certain conservative elements we see also.
Mm.
How do we connect it to that?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. I think that, at least in my mind, what I try to do is focus on these bigger issues, right? So I think if we focus on the 60s and 70s and the specificity of it, right? Like, in the farm workers, they were fighting for this daily wage versus that daily wage, or they were kind of calling for an end to a particular practice. I think it's important to focus on those things, but also kind of stepping back a little bit and how that relates to the question of human rights and basic human dignity. Because that is kind of one of those enduring values that I think people can recognize, right? So if they're thinking about issues that face communities today, this bigger question, it kind of helps, like, okay, so we can see how this group back in the 60s and 70s addressed that concern in a very specific way, but we can extrapolate perhaps a little bit, because the enduring core issue is inclusion. It is, sort of recognizing basic human rights. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but I think, especially with some of these groups that did address immigrant rights, I think that very much can connect to sort of the more recent waves of protests that we've seen in recent years regarding immigration reform and that sort of thing. I think recognizing the diversity within the Latino population is critical too. That there were people that were advocating for some things that, that were quite forward thinking, that can be considered to be more progressive, and that people can also, the community, because it's varied along class lines, people are going to have very different socioeconomic sort of situations that they come from. So that's going to inform their politics. Again, the experience of, dealing with, sort of the Cuban experience, right? That's going to inform, sort of their politics in the United States as well, and for many generations. And so, I think what we want to, in my mind, consider is, what are these larger enduring questions, and what are people's different approaches to that, right? And I think that that could be a way to kind of address this. You know, this is kind of isolated in the past,
Right.
but what are the things that are happening today that kind of fall under that umbrella?
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. John Underwood asks, in other decades, the labor movement was often falsely categorized as being associated with communism. Did the labor movement of the Latinx also get associated with communism during the Cold War era, or really how did it get? Because it did, obviously. So how did it get associated with communism?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it got associated because some people were actually members of, of the Communist Party. When we think about labor organizers, especially Emeten Ayuka was a member of the Texas Communist Party, as was her husband Homer Brooks. And that offered a critique of of sort of the conditions of people despite their socioeconomic class. Again, I think for some people, advocating something that is different from the status quo can be really challenging, right? It's something that, like, wait a minute, when people are saying we're calling for a revolution, that raises certain kind of flags, right? I think that, there was, sort of that direct association, and then I think that association by extension, that people could be pushing for civil rights, that even if it was through a citizenship strategy or a much more conservative approach, that they could still be accused of wanting to disrupt a system that quite frankly benefited people in power, right? Kind of going back to talking about laborers, and that sort of thing. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question. Um,
I think it's a good answer, in part because it gets at the point that perception is different from reality. I mean, there were obviously members of the Communist Party and people who were influenced by communism in the Latinx movement, but there was never a chance of communist revolution led by that movement. I mean, that's an exaggeration that was used for political purposes, as it was for African Americans and other groups,
yeah.
Jewish Americans and various other groups, I think.
Yeah, and then also I think the relationship between these groups, right? So there was often collaboration and at least support for one another's cause, and so sort of the guilt by association, so to speak, whether or not that was actually you know legitimate or not, the perception, I think, really played a factor, and especially when you have in the labor movement being very critical of a system that dehumanized an entire group. And as we'll see in the document, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who both were authors of the Plan of Delano, along with Luis Valdez, who's a playwright and an activist in the farm workers movement. They noted that this kind of labor system relied on pitting groups against one another, right? And so part of how Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the farm workers movement kind of grew was, the Filipino workers reached out to them like, hey, the growers, and to try to dismantle our movement, they're encouraging Mexican workers to cross the strike line. So how can we work together? And so these pointed critiques about the abuses of the labor system, I guess when you have that kind of critique, the sort of the idea of communist, influence will also come.
Yes.
These are very real, again, they're social issues. They're issues related to basic human dignity. Yeah.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So we have two questions on San Antonio, which of course is in a certain way a ground zero for this kind of analysis and this important history. So Emma Long asks about the pecan shellers strike in San Antonio. Did that labor activism have influence lingering into the late 20th century? And this connects really well to Nelly Rosales Nino's question, which is how, as someone teaching at a San Antonio high school that was involved in the student walkouts that you described so well, Monica, what can she use? How can we bring this alive for students in
Yeah,
place?
yeah. So I'll take the first question first, just chronologically, because it goes back to the 1930s. With the pecan shellers, it was a massive movement, right? And it was largely led by women who walked off the job in protest. Again, the movement unfortunately got, sort of tangled up in these Red Scare politics. And so, Emma Tenayuca, really bore the brunt of that. And, she was organizing through the CIO and the organizing the workers. And she was asked to step down because of the distraction, of the sort of the communist argument. Ultimately, what happened is the strike kind of fell apart. As they won a marginal victory in terms of the rate of pay, but then shortly thereafter, the pecan shelling industry mechanized, and it put all of these women out of work. And so we often see these sort of small victories, but then these enduring, sort of labor conditions. And so, in many ways, the movement, was this kind of moment of galvanizing around labor issues and sort of the treatment of workers. And often that story, that linear story that we like to tell, doesn't work. It looks more like this.
Right.
So those in some ways were the lingering connections. I think in the 60s and 70s, what you see is a reclaiming of this history, though. And so, for example, people and mural artists and people that are advocating for more culturally relevant curriculums in schools are pointing to these figures like Emma Tenayuca as heroes and as models for the kind of activism to inspire them. So, in some ways, there are these connections because it's a way of reclaiming that history and telling that history in a way that's meaningful and inspiring for the community. In terms of San Antonio high school walkouts, I would have to think a little bit more about specifically what kind of sources might exist for San Antonio. But what I use in my class, and I'm happy to share that with you all, is there's a wonderful collection of resources about the Ed Couch ELSA walkouts. It's a curriculum. It's done by a group in the Rio Grande Valley, and it includes documents and other materials that can be used, as well as learning activities and a lesson plan. What I've done is I've also looked at, there's a really great video, and I wish I had it queued up right now, but it's from 1968. It's the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. So it's a black and white recording of the newscast of the 1968 walkout in Ed Couch ELSA. And they talk to students. And so what's great about that, I love showing that in class because it kind of puts students in that kind of frame of mind and mindset, right? And you hear the words of the students themselves, because the CBS reporter is out there reporting from the Rio Grande Valley and asking students, why are you protesting? Why is this important to you? And I think that's a really great visual, in addition to including some of the statements of the demands. And I'm not even sure, there may be something in the Latino Americans, although that documentary by PBS, I think it mostly focuses on LA though. But I'm sure the materials exist. I'll have to dig around and hopefully can pass that along.
Well, and I think Kelsey, with remarkable speed, as always, put
nice.
YouTube to the documentary. That's great. I'm going to just start throwing out references. We'll see if Kelsey can keep up.
Challenge accepted.
Oh, okay. You'll regret
okay.
that. So I think it's time to turn to the document.